Well, thanks, Sulin. Thanks, Michael, for the introduction. Great to be here, everybody. It's too bad we're doing it this way, but it's great that we were able to connect this year. I'm going to get right into the research because there's two things I want to do for you today. One is share some data that we've been collecting outside of this project on how Canadians are feeling about the pandemic. I think it's important to understand how consumers and employees and citizens are feeling because it does, I think, predict or at least impact decisions that they're going to make, how comfortable they are sending their kids back to school, how comfortable they are coming back into the workplace, how comfortable they are going out into our community and consuming again in all those ways that many people right now maybe not feeling comfortable doing. So if we go to the first section, it's really about setting the context. And then I'll jump into the results or the key results from our Ottawa Business Growth Survey. The first thing on the next slide, Michael, is we've been doing regular tracking, national surveys of 1,500 or more Canadians regularly since March. And this is the most recent survey we did that we completed last week. And we asked on all of our surveys, how are you feeling right now when it comes to the coronavirus or COVID-19? How concerned are you or worried? And you can see that the level of concern remains quite elevated. A third of Canadians report feeling extremely worried or worried a lot about the pandemic. Another 25% say they are somewhat worried. And if we go to the next slide and we combine that extremely worried and worried a lot, you can see this is the trend line since back in February. So we saw that rapid rise in March. It kind of came down again into May and sort of bottomed out in June. But it's important to note that level of concern has actually gone up again in July, and it's kind of plateaued around a third of the country. And this is important to keep in mind because although our fears about, our health system being overwhelmed have subsided, about whether we can get toilet paper or household goods has subsided, there's still a very deep concern about a second spike. There's deep concerns about the economic impacts, and there's a lot of discomfort with doing many of the kinds of activities like going to a movie, going to a concert, even going to a restaurant that weren't there prior to this pandemic started. Now, one of the things on the next slide that we have also been tracking as a key indicator is we ask respondents, are you getting more worried or less worried about the pandemic or about coronavirus over the last few days? And you can see back in March, huge numbers saying they're getting more worried. There was a momentum of anxiety that was pushing people into that sense that I'm getting worried more over time, not less. Those two numbers came back quickly together in May, and you can see it's ebbed and flowed over the last number of months, but I point you to the far right part of your screen there. And over the last few waves, we've seen substantially more people saying they're getting more worried about the pandemic than less. And that's an indicator of that defensive position that I think many consumers, many employees are in. And we're gonna watch to see that blue line. That's the key indicator. Does that start going up again? That's gonna be a signal that people are gonna feel comfortable coming back and doing many of the things that they were doing. Last point, next slide, is an indicator about the future. Do you think the worst is still to come, or do you think the worst is behind us? And you can see that as of last week, still 44% of Canadians think the worst is still to come when it comes to this pandemic. That is higher than it was in June, higher than it was in May. And I think is part of this anxiety, this anxiousness that people are feeling, whether it's us going back to school, whether it's getting back into the workplace, all of these things for a large number of people remain a source of discomfort. And what's important to note is there's not a lot of regional differences here. Those living in larger urban centers in Ontario, a little higher elevation on these anxiety levels, but for the most part, these are drivers that are affected by your risk perception around the virus as opposed to where you live or how old you are or what gender you are. So that's a quick look at the context. So what does all this then mean for our business community here in Ottawa? And I think the primary objective of the study that we've done over the last 6 years is to get deep in understanding where's the optimism, where's the pessimism. And if you've been to an event in the past, I've presented at all of them, I've come and the results often haven't changed when it comes to our business confidence in the community. As you would expect, we're in a very different place today. And so many of the numbers I'm going to show you have seen huge shifts from the last number of years. So let's get into that. I will say that, again, the core purpose of this survey is to measure business confidence, right? Business confidence has a huge impact on whether we're going to take risks as business leaders, whether we're going to hire new people. And one of the key questions is, has your sales increased or decreased? And you can see this year, we have almost half of businesses saying their sales have declined over the last fiscal year. A third say it's up, but the key trend line is what percentage say it's increased. And you can see it's down almost 20 percentage points from last year. Only a third of businesses reporting higher sales last fiscal compared to the previous year. Similarly, when we talk about net income, about split, about equal numbers say my net income is better than it was last year, but same numbers say it's worse. But when we look at that over the trend line over the last number of years, on the next slide, you'll see, again, a decline, 9 points lower. So 37% reporting higher net income. Now, I will note 20 percentage point increase in businesses reporting their net income are down year over year. That is the largest increase in that indicator we have ever seen, and is I think, an indication that the business community is really divided between those businesses that might be doing okay or making it through or actually doing well, and those that are struggling right now. Now, future market expectations gives us a sense of how businesses are feeling about where the markets are going. And half of businesses in the community report that their expectations for the future market have worsened or will be worse over the next year. Only 1 out of 5 think that the market for their business will improve. Again, if we look at this trend line over time, a huge drop, almost like a cliff, where you had consistently over the last 5 years, about half of businesses feeling confident that their market will improve over time. We're now down to only 1 out of 5 businesses. So a big shift in that. Another big indicator of the confidence that people have is, will I recruit new employees? Will I see a downsizing of my workforce, or will I maintain it? You can see here, 1 out of 4 businesses still plan to recruit new team members over the next 12 months, but 21% now are reporting a reduction. And if we look at this trend line on the recruitment number, again, a big swing down. We had seen almost half of businesses last year saying they plan to recruit new team members. About half as many now feel that way. So mixed signals coming on that. Now, the last point, and probably the most stunning, is when we ask people, compared to last year, would you say your confidence in the local economy has increased? Has it declined? Is it the same? 70% of those that we interviewed, by the way, we interviewed over 600 business leaders in this survey, report that their confidence is down. And when we look at that over the trend line, this is the percentage who say their confidence is increased. It's at the lowest point we've ever registered. So we saw this improvement over the last number of years. It stabilized, and now we're at a very weak position in terms of confidence. So what does all this mean? Well, what we do is we aggregate all of these measures into a composite index, what we call the Business Confidence Index for the city. And you can see a number over 100 indicates positive confidence. A number below is negative. And this, not surprising, we are at a very different place in terms of overall business confidence. And I will note, if you look at all the different sectors where we have large enough sample sizes, it's across the board. So whether you're in construction, consulting, hospitality, you're very much very different place in terms of your confidence than you were last year. And so, the overall picture is one of deep anxiety, deep uncertainty, and a very different business environment, not surprising given the pandemic, than what we found last year. So Michael, I'll end there and look forward to the conversation.
Unmute myself. There I am. Thanks, David. That was a great job, and obviously some sobering statistics there. We're going to bring in Jim McConnery. Jim, we're bringing you right on screen here. Hey, Jim. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
And thanks, by the way, to Welch for being the major partner for this survey all these 6 years. Just to kick things off before you and David enter into a bit of a Q&A here, Jim, why is it that Welch is participating in this survey?
Thank you, Michael. Yeah, it's definitely the case. And you and I were chatting earlier. It's surprising that the survey has been around for 6 years. It's gone by very fast. But I think out of the gate, and the experience we've had is that it's providing very valuable insight and it provides valuable insight to us, Welch, as an organization. But separate from that, we see it as a very valuable tool for the business community. It's ideal that we're getting insight in terms of the feelings and the views on the local business community. I think it helps us when we're out in the marketplace and dealing with clients, but in a more global way, it's also helpful to the local business community. And then I think we knew from the start that this would be the case, but as we see information over a number of years, that becomes very valuable as well, that you can compare and evaluate how the city is progressing from year to year and what the outlook is for the future. So
Yeah,
it's
it's fascinating, and I'm sure David would agree. Now seeing kind of a 6-year trend, we are able to interpret the changes in this economy. So I think, as Suling said, and I'll get out of here and let you guys do your Q&A. We need data-driven decisions, and here's some data for people to focus on. So with that, I'll mute myself, Jim, and you take it away with David to explore two key themes of the survey.
Thank you, Michael. And David, thank you again to you and your team. It's been a fantastic collaboration from the start, but you and your team are very talented. And I echo Suling's comments that we're very fortunate to have you as a key participant. It's very clear that you deliver very valuable insight and expertise, and I just love the collaboration that we have with you and your team.
Thanks.
David, we've broken up our Q&A in terms of two key themes. And the first one deals with the government support relief programs that came to the forefront as we got into the COVID. My experience, and I think the overall experience, is that the programs were delivered very quickly. The concern I have, and I think the concern that people have more broadly as well, is that it's a massive amount of government spending. But as a tax person, I think it seems to be the right answer, the right approach, that the business community needed that support, the economy needed the support, notwithstanding that the amount of spending is unprecedented and leads to very, very material deficits. But it is very clear that it provided very timely and meaningful support to the business community in Ottawa, but across Canada. So David, maybe I'd be interested in your views as to how you think that's impacted our business community and how it's provided meaningful support, and whether or not the programs have generally met the anticipated goals.
Yeah, Jim, the evidence from our survey, and we asked one question about this: how has government relief measures impacted your organization? I think consider that over a third of businesses we surveyed said it kept their organization operational. 30% said it helped them avert layoffs, right? These are big numbers that are signaling to us without this support, they'd be in a very different position in terms of their ability to operate, their ability to continue to hire. Even 16% said it prevented their business from closing permanently, right? So imagine if this aid wasn't here, we could have seen, almost 1 out of 5 of the businesses in the community have to shutter up permanently, right? So your point about the cost of this, right? And we all feel that anxiety when we see those huge deficit numbers. The other side of it is it almost felt like it was absolutely needed, right? So then the question becomes, what happens next? But Jim, I'm curious from your perspective, because you mentioned how quickly, sometimes we criticize government for being slow and bureaucratic, but it was clear they really stepped up and delivered. How have your clients felt about their ability to access these programs? Is it, the programs are put in place quickly, but were they relatively easy to take advantage of?
Right. David, there's a number of programs, but definitely the one that stands out and I think is most relevant to the business community is the wage subsidy program, CEWS, but we call it the CEWS. And that program, I think, was very meaningful, very impactful. And it was very impressive, David, that companies could ascertain very quickly whether or not they qualified. And the online application process made it the case that money got out very quickly to businesses that met the requirements. I'd say the one caveat, and I think it was the right answer, that the program was developed very quickly. I think in normal situations, if you had a program of this magnitude, there'd probably be months and months of design of the program and the rules and the framework. But in this case, the program had to be delivered very quickly. And one key challenge is that qualification for the program is based on a revenue decline benchmark. a 30% decline comparing, a month in 2020 to a month in 2019. And that leads to some, I don't want to say anomalies, that you could think of organizations and companies that should and would need the support, but just don't meet that threshold. And then you can think of others that meet the criteria and get the benefit. I was talking to one client where, they had a decline in March 2020 compared to 2019, but it's because 2019 March was an abnormally good year. They're otherwise doing relatively good and they qualify for the program. You could have a different organization that is struggling and their revenue decline is 15% and it means they don't qualify. So I think, almost be the takeaway that they're winners and losers from a business perspective, because it didn't get to all the right organizations, but all things being considered, I think it was a good approach and it got the money out there fairly quickly.
That's interesting. I think we've got a poll question to ask of our audience here about the government programs.
We'll get that up on screen.
Going forward.
So here's the question. Everyone has an opportunity to vote. And the question is, this fall and beyond, how can the federal government best help with an economic recovery? You have 5 choices there and you can vote now. It's interesting that in the past, we normally sit in a room together and we had this funny device that was on a table that we shared and we'd go around the table. But that would seem like the craziest thing you could ever do in this COVID era. So it's nice that we have an online solution as an alternative. And there are the results, David. So maybe your impression of the
vaccine. It's all about a vaccine. I mean, we've done some research that shows when you ask consumers, for example, when are you going to feel comfortable going back to a concert, going to a movie theater, doing some of those mass kinds of consumption behaviors, they all point to, I'm going to wait till that vaccine's there. So in a way, we're not really going to, we know this, not get back to normal till that vaccine. But I do think it's interesting that, stimulating consumer spending, childcare, these are all part of the economic plan. I think, the government's thinking about as it lays out its agenda. We're going to see soon in the fall.
Excellent. David, the second area that we want to discuss is sort of how the business community and how businesses are adapting and how they're looking forward to recovery as we move beyond that initial stage of the pandemic. It's definitely clear that when we were in March and April, many organizations were essentially in a bit of a crisis mode. There was a need to act quickly, and there was a lot of uncertainty about the future. Remember at Welch, we would have had a meeting on a Wednesday afternoon and my colleagues and I were sitting in a room, but it might have been a Wednesday, but we were trying to anticipate how the firm would operate if we had to be in a remote mode at some point in the future. And I remember that it still seemed like a relatively remote possibility, but on the following Monday, Welch was fully remote. So, it happened very quickly that we got into that crisis mode and that mode where we're operating under a different framework. We're now beyond that stage, but I'm definitely interested, David, in your insight as to how you think the business community is adapting and what you see as the outlook in general.
Well, I think you point to one theme we saw in the survey, which was, I think a lot of businesses, particularly those that are office-based, reconsidering, their space requirements, right? That we may not get to a world where everybody's working from home, but I think, and Shopify might be the ultimate example on one end of this, where they're saying we're going to shutter our office completely. But I think you're going to see a lot of businesses, mine included, thinking about, what does space mean? What does physical space mean in a world where increasingly your team members may not want to come to the office every day, but also in one in which maybe the employer sees an opportunity to save some money on rent. But the other one that really came out in our survey was a clear signal from businesses that this crisis kind of forced them to rethink bringing new products, new services, right? Innovation, I think, was if you were able to do it, if your business was flexible enough, was a big part of how businesses adapted. You can look at stories here in Ottawa. I know one restaurant that I love going to, or restaurants across the board. If they were able to start offering, meal kits that you ordered, or now that they were able to offer wine or cocktails, you could subscribe to, Becta's wine list. And it allowed them to look at how you run a restaurant in a world first where people aren't able to come, but increasingly where even if they're able to come, can you find new revenue streams? So I think there's lots of that innovation. What was interesting in the survey, though, is reducing labor costs was an item. 32% of businesses thought they would have to do that, but it was less about cutting and reducing and more about evolving and thinking about new opportunities. And I think, in this crisis, in this really difficult period, I find myself in the same case. It's kind of forced you into a place and forced you to think about how can we change, how can we evolve, and really, I'm a market researcher, and so we've worked with a lot of clients who've asked the question, what does our customer need and how can we serve them? And so it almost ignited a new learning about what we need to know about our customers in order to best serve them during this crisis, but also years to come.
Right. And that's the one thing I've noted as well, David, is that the pandemic is a terrible scenario for the community and for the country in general. But the one bright side is that certain organizations were in a position where they had some great tools to perhaps facilitate collaboration or how teams work and communicate together. So we can think of a few scenarios where the pandemic has created new opportunities for organizations. A lot of it is tech related, but there are some organizations which are definitely doing excellent by virtue of new ways of working and collaborating.
Yeah. As much as we sometimes really hate technology and really, worry about what it's doing to us and our relationships, I just can't imagine this pandemic happening in like the 80s or 90s where this technology and our ability to do this wouldn't have been possible. So there's certainly some upsides to our ability and the technology to make it easier.
I agree. Let's move. I think we've got a second poll question. So this question is, which of the following statements best reflects your company's position? You have three choices there. We did not suffer a setback. We are hard hit, but we're adapting and recovering, or we are still suffering and uncertain about our future. David, your thoughts?
Well, I think it reflects what we showed in the survey, which is there's sometimes two worlds on this. And we see it at the household level too. We've got a set of businesses, a set of consumers, workers who have not really been affected, have actually performed maybe better as a result, found new opportunities. And then there are about half who say they were hit hard or they're still suffering. And so this is that push and pull. And I think, our audience, I think, reflects very much the business community right now in Ottawa.
Excellent. Thank you. I think that wraps up our panel discussion. David, thank you very much again for your insight, for presenting, but also all the efforts of you and your colleagues.
Thanks, Jim, and thanks for your support as well throughout this.
Yeah. Listen, guys, I think that was a great job. David, we've relied so much on you to conduct great surveys, bring great data. And again, Jim, thanks so much for the support that Welch and all of the other partners have lent us.